Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Midtown Scholar Bookstore's virtual event series. My name is Alex Brubaker. I'm the manager here at the Scholar, and as always, I am live in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania at the Bookstore. Whether you're joining us on Crowdcast or Facebook Live or even YouTube Live, I hope you're safe. Hope you're hanging in there. Hope you're getting some good reading in these days. Thank you so much for tuning in. If this is your first time with us, or maybe you've been to many of these, welcome to our live stream series. We absolutely love hosting these events, even though we can't be with you all in person. I think it's really nice to connect virtually here and try to offer some semblance of human connection with everyone to keep the conversation going about literature and books and why they matter. If you haven't yet purchased Catharine's book, I'd like to encourage you to do so. It's difficult to think of a more relevant book on history at this point in time, and your purchase helps us continue this author event series. It helps us support the author, our staff, and of course, you get a great book. At this time, we're offering free media mail shipping in the US to make the price more reasonable. So if you click the green button below, it will direct you to our website to purchase a paperback copy of the book. If you're watching this through Facebook Live or YouTube Live, just look in the comments section and you should see we provided a link there as well, or simply head to midtownscholar.com. And thank you for your support. While I have you here, I'd like to plug one thing. If you're here, you probably like books. We like books too, and we love hosting this event series. So please feel free to click the green button in the corner. It should be up there. It says follow. You can unfollow us at any time, so no pressure. But if you follow us on Crowdcast, you'll get a notification when we go live with our author events. Now today, we are very honored to welcome British historian Catharine Arnold and WITF health reporter Brett Schulstus to virtual Harrisburg. Brett Schulstus is WITF's transforming health reporter covering health policy and community health issues that affect Pennsylvanians. Previously, Brett was a business reporter at the York Daily Record, where his work included award-winning examinations of the nuclear power industry and food safety. He is a University of Pittsburgh graduate and a Pennsylvania Army National Guard veteran. Our author today is Catharine Arnold. Catharine studied English at Girton College, Cambridge, and holds a further degree in psychology. A journalist, academic, and popular historian, her previous books include The Sexual History of London, Necropolis, and Bedlam. Of course, the book we are here for today is titled Pandemic 1918. Here it is, Eyewitness Accounts from the Greatest Medical Holocaust in Modern History. So what's going to happen here today is Brett and Catharine are going to have a conversation here for about 30 minutes or so, and then I'll come back on to moderate the audience Q&A. So get your questions in now. If you have a question for Catharine or even Brett, click the Ask Question button down below, and that will allow me to use your question in the Q&A. So get your questions in during the conversation. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome onto the screen Brett Schulstus and Catharine Arnold.
Hello.
Hello, and it's so
Hi.
good to be here, and it's so good to get to talk to you today, Catharine.
It's a pleasure, honestly.
And you're coming to us from Nottingham.
Absolutely, Nottingham, yes, in the UK. Yeah, my home city.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, you know, there are so many great entrance points to this conversation about your book, Pandemic 1918, which I found to be just gripping and fascinating because of your approach of using those eyewitness accounts from the time. I think where I might want to start, since we are kind of communicating from across the pond, so to speak. You know, when I think about that time period, 1918 and 1917, I think here in the U.S. we don't have the same appreciation for the World War I era that the UK has, I believe, because we weren't quite as involved in it until farther along in the war. I wonder if we could start with a question on that time period and how the origins of the pandemic and the Spanish flu were tied into everything else that was going on in the world at the time, in Britain and elsewhere.
Well, that's a big question, but in a sense, yes, you're correct in that the US didn't really enter the war until 1917 under Woodrow Wilson, who decided to throw his weight behind the Allies. And so the US war effort happened over a very short, a remarkably short period of time, just 18 months or so, when young lads from the Midwest, the so-called doughboys, were suddenly mobilized. And these were farm boys mostly. These were boys from the prairies. And they were suddenly taken to the big military camps. And the problem was that because they'd grown up in the country, they didn't have the immunities of some of the boys who'd grown up in the city. So you take boys who'd grown up in New York, in Harlem, in tough areas of Chicago, they had grown up and absorbed many, many different sorts of bacteria from the day they were born. They'd been made susceptible to all the viruses and the bacterial infections that were surrounding them. But the farm boys, when they were faced with this particular kind of pandemic flu, they had no immunity. They couldn't cope with it. So that's one aspect of it. And that's possibly one aspect why around 550,000 US citizens, including the military and civilians, died from the Spanish flu pandemic because they simply had no resistance to it, whereas people who'd grown up in Europe had a bit more resistance and were stronger and were more able to cope with it.
Of course, I'm getting a little bit of an echo there.
Okay.
Of course, as we think about this today, it's always against the backdrop of everything that's happening in the world right now with the coronavirus. I see questions coming in that are tied to the coronavirus. And here in the United States, it's killed more than 73,000 people so far.
73,000 now, wow, yes, my God.
I know as you and I look at everything on social media and so forth and see people's responses to that, you can see that this is something we haven't experienced in our lifetimes. When you think about the 1918 pandemic, kind of put us in the shoes of those people who were experiencing that for the first time. Was it a similar level of unprecedented event that's just tough to even wrap your head around whenever it's going on and beginning to unfold around you?
Yeah, what's worse about the thing about what's happening now is that when we began to receive those reports from China, my immediate response was, oh my God, this is what happened last time, and hopefully our governments will handle it a lot better than they did in World War One. I mean, there are strong differences. For instance, in World War One, we were all caught up in the biggest global conflagration, the biggest war ever. That's why they called it the Great War. That was always at the forefront of people's minds when they're trying to deal with Spanish flu, that they had to win the war. So thank God, we're not caught up in the middle of a major war while this is going on. But there are similarities which I found disturbing.
Yeah, reading the book, I was taken particularly by a few passages early on where, for example, there were conspiracy theories that the Germans, who of course we were at war with at the time, had caused the flu, and just made me think of all the different conspiracy theories that run rampant, or that are running rampant right now. Speak about that a little bit. Tell the story of what we eventually learned caused the flu, and also what were some of the misinformation going on at the time.
Yeah, well, the misinformation. People always want to blame somebody else, right? We know this when we do sort of experiments in Psychology 101. You get a classroom full of people with brown eyes, blue eyes, divide it down the middle. You've immediately got an in-group and an out-group, and they can be nasty to each other ad infinitum. One of the first conspiracy theories that arose with Spanish flu in the US was the idea that Bayer, who were originally a German company who made aspirin, that Bayer were actually responsible for Spanish flu. Totally ridiculous, but it gained some ground, it gained some currency, because various conspiracy theorists at the time were saying Bayer aspirin was actually full of Spanish flu, and it was being spread among the population by Germans. It's never proved. It's complete fallacy. There was also a rumor going around that German subs had rocked up to the shores of the east coast shores of the US and actively put Spanish flu kind of into the community where people would get it. The thing that blows this whole idea out of the water is the fact that the Germans suffered even more badly than the Allies in terms of the troops and the civilians. They suffered just as badly with Spanish flu as we did, if not more, including Kaiser Wilhelm, who contracted Spanish flu but actually survived. But I think it's because when there's a massive traumatic episode like the one we're suffering now, certain people will always want to find someone to blame instead of just saying, it's happened, it's arisen, we don't know why. Certain part of us will always want to say that we can hold responsible. So the Spaniards blame the Italians. Many people blame the Spaniards. In Poland, they blamed the Russians. They said it was spread by the communists. So everybody had a view on this, and most horrible of all, of course, in Russia, they blamed the Jews. So everybody gets handed sort of, in the worst possible way, everybody gets handed the blame for something that was purely a physical manifestation. I mean, we think now that Spanish flu basically arose from a species of bird flu that in some way mutated and started to infect humans. It crossed the species barrier, and humans started to succumb to something that was normally limited to animals and birds. But, you know, that's not a tub-thumping response, and so often people just want a political message, and they'll look for it.
Yes, of course, we're seeing that going on right now. And Catherine, if you don't mind, I'm going to quickly plug in these headphones.
Yep.
And do a quick sound test. Can you hear me okay now, Catherine?
I can, yes. Would you like me to
wonderful.
put headphones on?
You sound great from my end, but I'm going to put these headphones on just in the interest of making sure that everybody who's listening, that you all can hear me clearly and that there's not an echo. On that note of how it affected everybody around the world, the Germans, the Russians, the people in Britain, the US, and everywhere. Can you take a minute, especially for those who are listening today who may not be as familiar with the level of carnage that this wrought around the globe, and just kind of walk through those numbers? How many people were affected by this, and kind of chart its time period of its first and second wave?
Okay, well, totally. Can you hear me okay?
Very clearly.
That's better, yeah. Totally, we have an estimate of 100 million people who died as a result of Spanish flu. And this is the figure arrived at by Professor John Oxford, who is very much kind of the big daddy of Spanish flu, a guy who's been studying it and researching it for 50 years. So it breaks down at 550,000 in the United States, 230,000 in England and Wales, 18 or 19 million in India, and they've never really got to the bottom of the figures for Africa, but it's suggested to be something like 1 in 3, because obviously the data that you can get from the US and Europe is fairly straightforward in terms of public health records. It's far more difficult to get really reliable data from countries where everybody was living at subsistence level. And in many areas, decent records just weren't kept. And in fact, decent records towards the end of the epidemic weren't even kept in the West. Doctors would just scribble something. It would be hard to put a proper cause of death the way you might do in normal circumstances. You know, I think this huge figure has to include within it children of families who just starved to death because their parents were dying. People who already had people with premorbidities, existing health conditions that made them vulnerable.
Right. And I have to ask, when we think about that, and when we think about how everybody would have known somebody who died from this, why did you decide to write a book that really focused on eyewitness accounts and first-person narratives and kind of tell the story through those different individuals rather than more of a, officials and science and data. What was your thought behind that approach, and kind of what was your journey going through that approach of writing this book?
Okay, well, my response was very personal. I came in sort of as Spanish flu studies were beginning to become a thing. There were a number of academic texts looking at Spanish flu from the point of view of medical research, economics, geopolitics, that kind of thing. But my previous books had always taken a very personal view of history, and they'd always been predicated on the model of people sharing their experiences. My background as a journalist was about features. It was about human interest. And I thought, if I can gather enough of people's personal accounts from different backgrounds, different cities, different ways of life, I can give a really rounded view of it. And also the readers will find somebody in there that they can identify with. Now, at times, it was a bit like a disaster movie. It was trying to create every sort of person that a reader or a viewer could associate themselves with and feel comfortable with. But once I started looking, there was a lot of material under the surface, but I had to tap down into things like diaries and letters from the Imperial War Museum in London. I had to look at biographies of famous people to see if they'd succeeded, if they'd been through it and survived. I had to look into the lives of artists and writers. Very little from US and British writers about the experience of Spanish flu. But I just looked everywhere I could to find sort of data that would humanize it and bring it to life. And what happened in the end was that shortly before my book came out, another book came out about Spanish flu. And my agent said, "Oh, there's this other book come out about Spanish flu. Is that going to be a problem?" And I looked at it, and no, it wasn't, because the other book, by law, you get hold of it, she's a science journalist, so she looks at it very much from a science point of view. And in the end, we've done events together. And at the moment, we've sort of got the whole thing covered, because Laura's articles are very much about the scientific implications and the new stuff that's going on with COVID. And mine is still about the human response to it. So,
well, and I know that
approaches, the two approaches are complementary. Yeah.
I agree, and I know that on that note, people are going to want to talk about different ways that that we can view COVID-19 through the lens of the past. Before we do that, though, I would like you to share just one of the anecdotes from your story and summarize it in briefly. Just one person whose account really stuck with you after you told it yourself, because I think it's important to get to that, individual accounts that are the heart of the book.
I certainly can. Let's see what I've got. I'll just find something that really feels personal. It's actually a news story, but it's alluding to something that happened. So this is a news story from the Seattle Post-Intelligencer from round about October 1918, 30th of October 1918. And this account is headlined, "Native Daughter Dies." And it says, "Mrs. McCarthy died on last Wednesday and her husband on the following day. The children are recovering. Mr. and Mrs. Preston, informed of the serious condition of their daughter, left Seattle for Minneapolis last Wednesday, but Mrs. McCarthy died before they arrived." Now, here we have a simple human tragedy of a family who were traveling to be almost on holiday when the flu hit, and the parents died in transit, and the children were lucky to survive. But it's got a twist, because one of the children was a child called Mary, and she grew up to be Mary McCarthy, the famous American novelist and contributor to The New Yorker. author of the group. And Mary later on penned a memoir of surviving Spanish flu and then growing up with her rather cold and distant relatives after their family had died. And that kind of struck a chord with me, because as they were traveling, they had no idea that they were taking part in one of the biggest historic episodes to happen in the United States. They were just an ordinary family. And that really struck a chord with me.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. And I think that's something that we're all experiencing now. We don't know, and we're always trying to understand how big of a deal is this, and also judge what the appropriate response is. Here in Pennsylvania, we have shut down a lot of businesses. A lot of people have been largely in their homes for the past couple months, but we've already begun to see what seemed like a public health crisis that could unify everyone. We've begun to see that get politicized. Some of my colleagues who are more political than I am as reporters told me, well, it was always political. And we've even seen protests and rallies opposing some of the public health measures, which I, as a health reporter, I find to be very frustrating, even though I think I can understand some of the economic anxieties that underlie those. So I guess what I would ask you about is, how did some of the communities, cities, countries respond as this began to sweep through their regions, and what lessons might we learn today from their response?
Well, I'd start off by saying that because there was a war on, there was no kind of single unified response. I mean, obviously here in the UK, we've got lockdown and that's it, and most people are dealing with it and accepting it. And I know in the States, you've got some states where they're observing lockdown and some states where they're not. It's on a state-by-state basis. But there was resistance. In December 1918, in San Francisco, the mayor passed a motion stating that nobody should be seen out without a mask in public. And most people accepted this because they felt that there was a valid reason for it. However, with a group called the Anti-Mask League, and these guys met. It's not stated whether this was in a room or in an open space, but they all met up, and it was composed of doctors, legislators, and some cranks. And it contained moderates and extremists. And the moderates said, well, we don't really see any point in wearing a mask. It's unconstitutional. We don't think it's going to get anywhere. The extremists just violently opposed the idea of wearing masks. The moderates were saying, let's present a petition to the mayor saying, lift the restriction. We don't want to wear masks. Just make it, a matter of choice. The extremists were, hell no, we're never going to wear masks. It's unconstitutional. It was left at that point. And then on the 18th of December, 1918, an improvised explosive device was delivered to the public health offices in San Francisco, and it contained 3 pounds of gunpowder, an alarm clock to power it, buckshot, glass, all the stuff you'd expect in an amateur homemade bomb. Mercifully, it didn't explode, but at this point, the mayor's office thought, right, this is proving so unpopular, we may have to lift it. So eventually, after the usual kind of council meetings and so on, 31st of January, the mayor, we're lifting the thing. You don't all have to wear masks if you really don't want to, but can we advise you that if you stop wearing masks, the death rate will go up? So the requirement to wear masks in public was duly scrapped. 10 days later, the death rate had soared by 300 people. And when I see the stuff that's happening at the moment, I find it utterly terrifying and bewildering because, yes, I know, I want a haircut. I want to get my nails done. They're shocking, but I'm not prepared to put my safety and the safety of my family and the people on my street and the person who do my nails. I'm not prepared to put all that at stake simply for a minor beauty procedure. It's
And
something we've just had to deal with.
yeah, it's surprising what people think is an infringement on their freedoms.
Yeah.
And I have a certain amount of understanding for some of those positions, especially the economic one. But it's everybody's in this together, and of course, this wasn't created by the Democratic governor, of Pennsylvania, for example.
Yes, exactly.
I have to ask, you talk about how after places like San Francisco loosened restrictions, it led to an increase in cases. Can we talk a little bit more globally about the waves of the Spanish flu? How I think that there was, in your book, there was one peak, and then there was a much more significant peak later. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that, and again, maybe relate it to what we're going through today.
To the best of my ability, I will, yes. Basically, Spanish flu is regarded as having occurred in 3 waves. So the first wave, we're talking April 1918. It occurs in France. It occurs in the US. It kind of lingers for a few months. It occurs significantly in Spain, which is where Spanish flu gets its name from, when it infects the king, Alonso XIII, but he doesn't die, thank heavens. And then it mysteriously just dies away. So from a peak of infection where, for instance, 700 people in London died, suddenly it's no longer active. Then it redoubles its efforts really towards July, September, in Europe and in the States, and it's a stronger version of the virus. Those who already have had it seem to be inoculated against it. They seem to have developed immunity, but it's more savage, the symptoms are more severe, and it's more dangerous. Right, it kind of tears through the world in the late summer of 1918. Then it begins to drop off again after October, only to flare up to a certain extent in November with the armistice, when thousands, millions of people all gathered together to celebrate armistice. And of course, it was spread among the civilian community. And then it lingers on effectively into January and the spring of the following year. And it lingers in pockets. So there may be some areas where it seems to have burnt itself out. And there does seem to be evidence that it's burnt itself out through herd immunity, which is a rather discredited concept these days, but certainly is what seems to have happened with Spanish flu. But the remainder of it was still strong enough, for instance, to kill off massive amounts of Native Americans in Alaska and Canada, because they had no natural immunity to it. They'd never been exposed to anything like it before. And entire settlements were just washed out, were just wiped out.
And I do think it's worth noting that while we have been drawing many parallels between the Spanish flu and COVID-19, they are different in their epidemiology and severity. And so just briefly, maybe we should touch on that, since you're talking about how brutal this was at the time. Can you speak to the disease itself, what it did to people, what you learned from the firsthand accounts, and the ways that it would affect people?
Yeah, I mean, the thing about Spanish flu, from the off, the symptoms were very different. The symptoms, for instance, of coronavirus are similar to conventional flu. Spanish flu was really nothing like. It was a very swift onset, and it was characterized by hemorrhages, by sickness, by vomiting and diarrhea, by bleeding from the lungs and nose. People infected could die within hours. They collapsed in the street. They had this distinctive skin tincture where their skin turned blue from lack of oxygen. And in many cases, even with the survivors, the victim's hair turned white. So you can understand why some medically qualified doctors were thinking that they were dealing with a form of plague because they had never seen anything like it. The other distinctive features were that it occurred in the spring and summer, when we normally associate flu with the winter months. And traditionally, flu attacks the old and the very young, and people with premorbidities, people who are already suffering maybe from cancer, or in those days tuberculosis and rickets. The thing about Spanish flu is it attacked the healthiest and the fittest. It was a form of autoimmune response, rather like HIV. So ironically enough, the fitter you were, if you're a fit young soldier, you're far more likely to die than if you're an elder in their 60s and 70s. That's what made it such a challenge, and that's why doctors and healthcare experts had never witnessed anything like it. And this, of course, you can understand why this led to the theories of it being some kind of chemical weapon.
Sure, if people have never experienced anything like it before, and it seems to be really running rampant, I could see that. I know that we are going to be shortly turning it over to Alex for questions from our audience.
Sure.
Perhaps before we do that, I'm going to just throw one more question at you while I have a chance. If you were to characterize the sort of overarching significance of this event, of the Spanish flu, in world history of the first half of the 20th century, can you rank it up there and kind of talk about how it had long-lasting effects that went well through the century? It's something I don't know the answer to myself, which is why I'm asking.
Yeah,
how significant
basically,
was it?
it's up there with the shooting of Archduke Ferdinand for its importance and for its significance. Because while we always think of World War I as the most significant event of that period, for us 1914 to 1918, Spanish flu just compounded what had already happened with the war. Every nation on earth had lost so many young men and had lost so many women too to nursing. And suddenly along comes this killer virus and takes out those young men who've already survived the war. One of the tragedies was that many men came home. They got back to the US, or Blighty as we call it, thinking, fine, I can start my life again, only to find their entire families had been wiped out, or indeed to succumb themselves. This in its turn led to deprivation, an economic downturn, and at a practical level, a lack of men. There were no guys to take on the family farm or the shop or the business. There were no guys to train up as doctors and barristers or actors and musicians. This has been written about before. There just was a tremendous shortage of husbands for eligible women. The plus side, you could say, is that women were drawn more into work in the professions because they had to be. But the negative side was economic turmoil, because many small businesses floundered. Farms couldn't go on because they had nobody to run them. And this in turn led to the Depression, I believe, in the crash of 29, and also sadly in Europe to nations turning towards nationalism, because they wanted somebody to blame, and they felt that lining up behind nationalistic leaders like Mussolini and Hitler, they felt that was the only thing they could do. So you cannot underestimate it. I mean, one argument is that Spanish flu, the impact of Spanish flu in India, led to Indian nationalism and independence, because the Indian nationals felt that they'd been betrayed by the Raj. They hadn't been cared for.
Fascinating answer. And Catherine, it's been so great talking to you, and I look forward to hearing some of Alex's questions from the audience.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to turn to the audience now. So to all our viewers out there, if you have a question and you're on Crowdcast, just click the button below. It should be below our faces. It says ask a question. We're going to get to as many questions as possible here. Catherine, first off, I want to start off. We have a couple questions about your research. So let me see. All right. So Donna asks, quote, what were your specific research sources, and are they available to the general public?
Yeah, some of them certainly are. I started off finding whatever I could on the internet, as one always does. I looked in the archives of the Imperial War Museum because I knew that a book about Spanish flu had been written about 30 years earlier called The Spanish Lady, and that the author of that had looked at resources from the Imperial War Museum. From there, I got lots of letters and diaries, mostly from people who'd done active service. I looked at newspapers, obviously, of the day, and I looked at biographies and autobiographies of people who'd lived through those times. So basically, every time I picked up a history book, I'd look in the index and think, well, did that person live through Spanish flu, or did they know somebody who did? So I kind of amassed an archive that way. And then after the book was out, people started sending me family stories. Every time I'd give a talk, somebody in the audience would have an anecdote. So I've kept all those as well, maybe for a later edition. But yeah, the information's out there if you look for it. There was also, I'll mention this, there's a very good PBS series about 30 years ago about Spanish flu, and quite a lot of resources there.
This next question is another question related to the research, and it kind of expands to COVID. But this question is from Heidi. They say, I'm a professional archivist and curious to hear more about the primary and archival sources that you used to write your book. What was missing from the archival record for the pandemic of 1918? And from your perspective, what can archivists and other historians do now to help future researchers better understand the current COVID-19 pandemic?
It's difficult to say what was missing. I think a lot of people possibly hesitated to record their experiences, or they didn't have the ability to because they were locked out of that. They didn't have the resources. What's happening now, we've got a thing running in England with the BBC called COVID Diaries, where people are filing their responses to it. And I think we need to encourage more of that. It's much easier to do that now with social media.
This next question is from Jane. They ask, why was Bayer targeted as the cause?
Sheer prejudice, simply because Bayer had a German name. So whoever started the conspiracy theory that Bayer was responsible for trying to poison the American public with flu disguised as aspirin, just the kind of cheap trick that still happens these days, that you associate with some people who just want to throw shade on a particular organization.
This next question is from Chris. They say, how long and hard was the economic recovery after the Spanish flu? What worked and what didn't in terms of recovery?
Well, that's huge. And I think I should refer them back to my previous answer about 1929, because obviously I believe that the United States wasn't as badly affected by the aftermath of World War I as, for instance, Germany. But at the same time, it took a dip. And I still believe that the crash of 1929 was a response to economic decisions that were made in 1918. There was kind of like a bit of a false start, wasn't there? Because, directly after the end of the First World War, you think of the early 1920s, the picture you get of the United States then was of the roaring 20s, lots of parties, Great Gatsby, that whole thing. But in a sense, that was misleading. So for every expensive, glittering party that was happening, people were struggling.
And now we're going to get into, we have a lot of questions about, comparisons to COVID-19 here. So Brett, feel free to jump in for any of these questions that are related to COVID, if you can provide kind of your expertise on Pennsylvania. And I mean, you're doing the news daily with COVID-19, so you're very up to date. So we'll do some comparison related questions. This first question is from Elizabeth. They say, I have read that very little was written, such as in novels or research books, about the 1918 pandemic for 60 or so years. If that is true, do you have thoughts about why that would be so? In contrast, we've had countless books about World War II, for example. And then they go on to, they say they suspect that many books, fiction and nonfiction, will follow this pandemic. And that's actually kind of, as booksellers, we talk amongst ourselves and we're like, oh my God, we can't imagine the amount of nonfiction books, and even it's going to infiltrate fiction that are going to be published in the coming years.
Yeah, there's going to be an absolute avalanche of books. Somebody asked me last week if I was going to write a book about it, but I really don't think so. I think by the time we've done this, I'll never want to read another word about flu again. But it's interesting that being a literature graduate and being a writer, one of the first places I looked was to see what creative literature there was about Spanish flu, and very, very little. So it gets mentioned, obviously, by Catharine Arnold in Pale Horse, Pale Rider, which is her memoir of surviving it. On Steinbeck had Spanish flu but survived. And there's a mention in, I think it's Look Homeward Angel by Thomas Wolfe. There's a character in that who dies of what is clearly Spanish flu. But it's amazing how little was recorded about it. And I mean, my theory about it is that it was such a horrific event and so painful to witness, because many of these people died at home. They didn't, in the civilian world, they didn't die in hospitals. There's no room in the hospitals. They were dying at home. And so you were seeing your loved ones go through this horrific pain. One of the latest resources I've just discovered, courtesy of my Uncle Tony, is a whole archive of Yiddish songs, Yiddish music, dealing with what's called the Menschenfresser, which is the Yiddish word for Spanish flu. And that's something I hadn't had a chance to look at before. So that will prove interesting to see what the response was from the Jewish population. But no, you'd expect there to have been. I'm constantly surprised that there wasn't more.
This next question is from Sandra. They say, and you kind of touched on this earlier, but didn't the Spanish flu particularly affect people in the prime of life, unlike COVID-19, which seems to be often targeting the old and people with underlying medical conditions? And they go on to ask, doesn't this mean that long-term there will be different economic effects? And Brett, if you could chime in, we'll let Catherine go first, but if you could chime in on this after Catherine as well.
Sounds good.
Yeah, sure. Economically, in our country in particular, a lot of older conservative with a small c people have been saying, well, only the old people are getting it. Who cares about them? Let's protect the economy. We need to think about the young. That's not my view, just making that clear, you know. But that's been one argument. COVID or coronavirus does seem to affect normally the people you would expect it to affect, older people with existing comorbidities. Spanish flu affected the young because it triggered an autoimmune response like HIV, and like HIV, it affected the youngest and the fittest. I'll hand over to Brett for the next bit.
Well, I completely agree with you. And in Pennsylvania, a third of the deaths tied to COVID-19 have been people in nursing homes. So these are people who are older and who often already have a lot of those risk factors that we've determined make a person not only more susceptible to be symptomatic, but also more susceptible to die from it. The individual's question is an interesting one because it talks about long-term economic impact, something that I'm certainly not qualified to speak on, but I will say this. I don't think that we should rule out the long-term risks that this may have for people who are not in that older population. We're now learning, you've read stories about people developing peculiar hypercoagulation related disorders, having strokes, having pulmonary embolism related symptoms. And that's just very unusual. And we've also seen now younger people being hospitalized with a series of symptoms believed to be related to this, or if not hospitalized, studied. So I think that we're not out of the woods yet in terms of knowing what this is going to do to people.
I think that's absolutely correct. There's a concern at the moment in the UK that it can affect children because some of the tabloids are saying, well, you know, children are presenting with certain symptoms. I don't think we can take anything for granted. I was told last week that coronavirus hasn't shown signs of mutating as other forms of flu do, but we know so little about it. It's so new that as you say, we should take nothing for granted. And though it would be easy to say, yes, it's only the oldies who are going to get it, one of our daughters mentioned to me the other week that a friend of hers that she'd worked with in a store had shockingly died of it at the age of 27. And this was just, there are possible explanations for this, but even then, it was devastating to think of it being so close to home to somebody so young.
And that's terrible to hear, Catherine. I've heard stories like that here in the United States as well. But it also makes me wonder. It also makes me wonder if, because this isn't something that's presenting to those, primarily to those young, healthy people, if we might be more prone to be sort of harassed by waves and waves of it over the next couple years. And again, it's more of speculation than anything, but especially as we see people saying, "Oh, well, we don't need to take this that seriously. It only affects X, Y, and Z people." Yeah,
I totally. I mean, it would be very easy for our daughters who are 25 and 27 to say, "Oh, yeah, it's not going to get to us," but there's no guarantee that it isn't. And obviously, the young will suffer economically for what's happening. There's no doubt about it. But yeah, this could change. And just because it's taking out the older people now doesn't mean to say that it couldn't completely change tack. I mean, Taubenberger, who's one of the great epidemiologists and virologists, had said the thing about flu is it's a very clever little virus and it will change. I mean, we get a flu jab every year, and every year it's different because the flu will have changed, it will have mutated, and so the jab we get needs to be different to cope with that. I would also say that we will have quite a few more, not necessarily waves, but even if we think we've got on top of it for the time being, I think all the preparations and the restrictions we have in place now could be wheeled out again. Laura Spinney, her argument is that we could be looking at social distancing measures such as we see in stores into 2022. But, if that's what it takes to stay safe, then that's what we have to do.
This next question is from Nicole. They say, do other countries around the world have the responses that Americans do in regards to refusing to wear masks?
I haven't heard so much of this, possibly because I've just been focusing on the reaction in the UK and the United States. I know that the lockdown, the restrictions in Spain and Italy were very strict, and the majority of people seem to have gone along with that there. So
it's important too, I think, to note that in the United States, the resistance to the masks isn't exclusively something that came about organically. It's a confluence of very real fear and frustration with economic, with losing your job or not having money. But it's been well established at this point that a couple of conservative far-right groups, and in particular, a group of brothers who have created gun rights groups online for various states. They basically rolled this out across the country, especially in not exclusively in, but in a lot of swing states and democratically controlled states, basically created Facebook groups called, Reopen Michigan, Reopen Pennsylvania, Reopen Ohio, Reopen whatever. And so they've taken that frustration and that fear and managed to kind of coalesce it around opposition to the Democrats, fear of losing your Second Amendment rights, a number of conservative causes, and also support for Donald Trump, who himself has been vocally calling for things like liberate Michigan, which was his response to Michigan's protective safety measures.
Yes, and so we have scenes like the ones in Michigan where they're caught. There are people outside with placards, people coming into the building with guns, saying, let's shoot the governor, let's kill Gretchen, which in a civilized society is pretty horrific to see. But yes, I totally get that these things do tend to be drummed up by certain special interest groups who will then lobby to get a following. And it's sad, because what we should all be doing at this time is finding that we have more in common than we then we don't. We should all be on the same side.
I want to go back to 1918 for a second here. This question from Nicole is one that's kind of been brought up a lot lately about the sources and origins of the pandemic of 1918. But Nicole says, Barry's book sources the origin to Kansas. Where does your work place the potential source of the Spanish flu?
Yeah, well, I think Barry's right in that. But there's, when I started to research it, there was considerable difference between some experts who thought that it was Kansas and some who felt that it was France. And I'm quite happy to embrace kind of both arguments without coming down one side or the other. So some people say, like Barry, yes, it started in Kansas. It started at Fort Riley, and we have all the accounts of that first outbreak in I think it's February 1918. But then there are also accounts of a very similar outbreak in Britain at an army camp, and in France at Etaples, which is a massive camp there. But what you have to bear in mind with all three accounts is that there were already troop movements. People were already moving from one camp to another. So it's very hard, I think, to say where it started. The common thread for me is the fact that Chinese labourers were employed in Britain and the United States. They came over from China to help with war effort as labourers. And they came from China, which sadly has been the seat of many pandemics. So it's quite possible that unwittingly the flu virus travelled with them.
I'm going to combine two of these questions from Allison and Charlotte, but it's basically trying to draw comparisons from 1918 to today. So Charlotte says, what lessons do you think lie inside your book that can be applied to the circumstances we are currently facing with COVID and the lockdown?
Well, I'd say that the lesson that we learned from 1918 is that quarantine, social distancing, hygiene, masks, all of those responses have validity and can help contain an epidemic. It can't stop it, but we can certainly contain it. And also, so much effort went on the war in 1918. That was the primary objective, to win the war. And so authorities weren't focusing on the virus the way that we are now. Now, as I've said elsewhere, it's like it's World War II, but we're on the same side. So we have much more in the way of resources to tackle it through education and through the social distancing measures I've mentioned. So that's the big take-home message for me. But also the fact that we have to be prepared for it. We have to live through this now, and we have to be prepared for recurrences or mutations in the future. We can't just say, by November, the whole country opens up again, the US opens up again. Things are never going to be the same. Air travel won't be the same. Restaurants. Unfortunately, theatre and the music world will bear the scars for years to come, possibly never recover.
And we're running out of time here, so I'm gonna wrap up with one more question here. This question is from Yasmin Piper, who is a friend of the Bookstore and a writer over at the Berg magazine. So she asks, what do you think the world will look like after the end of this pandemic, specifically in England and the United States?
I wouldn't say unrecognizable, but it's beginning to feel more like the 1950s. Take out the Cold War and the fears over the bomb and McCarthyism. But in other respects, life has become much more suburban and provincial. And the way we live our lives is also more intimate because we're on lockdown with our families or we're socially isolated. Our concept of celebrity, for instance, has become totally inverted. In 5 minutes, the people on my street are all going to go out and clap for the National Health Service workers, whereas 5 months ago, they might have been interested in what was happening in Heat magazine. Our values have changed, and it's been a wake-up call that we all have to help each other and stick together. That's what I take from it.
So we have to wrap up. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Brett. This has been a really tremendous conversation. The book is Pandemic 1918. It's available in paperback. Again, if you click the link below, it's a green button. It says Purchase Pandemic 1918. You can purchase a copy through us. Free media mail shipping on all U.S. orders. We're happy to get the book in your hands as soon as possible. Brett and Catherine, thank you again so much. To our viewers, thank you for tuning in. And I'll give you both the last word.
Thank you for listening. Stay safe. Stay home. Save lives.
Catherine, it's been so wonderful talking to you. You guys have a great afternoon. Or evening in your case.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Take care.
Have a good
Bye-bye.
day. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.